All right, everybody. So we're going to pick up on the second half of Notes A and talk a little bit about what happens to Lincoln and the rest of the country after the assassination. And essentially, once Lincoln has been assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, the Republicans that are left behind, might have disagreed with Lincoln a little bit about his 10% plan, and who we've referred to as the radical Republicans, are going to be the guys that are taken over. On your left, you're going to see William Seward. On your middle, Charles Sumner. You've seen those two guys before. In fact, Seward was the one that was attacked on the same night of the assassination and stabbed several times. Charles Sumner was the man who was beat in Congress during the 1850s with a cane and almost died for his works. And then the last one there is Thaddeus Stevens. So these three guys are going to take over, and the radical Republicans are going to really be the group that's in control for most of the Reconstruction time period. This is a group that strongly supported emancipation, meaning they were very in favor of achieving greater civil rights for former slaves. They felt like it was their duty to use federal power to bring about more equality and more justice for individuals who had just been freed after the war. And all of this was coupled together with the idea that they really wanted to suppress and take advantage of the former Confederates. And so the radical Republicans, they're not all bad. They're not terrible people. In fact, they worked very tirelessly to achieve better civil rights. But their policies are not going to be very forgiving to the South, and they're not going to be lenient like Lincoln's plan was. Lincoln really wanted to build national unity after the war. He felt like it was more important to bring the country back together, and the radical Republicans didn't see it that way. So, yes, the Republicans are going to be in power in actuality, but the man who's going to lead the country after the war is, in fact, here on the right-hand side, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the vice president when Lincoln was shot. And so Johnson gets thrust into the leadership role here, really in a way that he probably was not prepared for. Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. In fact, he was the only senator in the Confederate states that remained loyal to the Union, and so the South doesn't like him very much. But at heart, he is still a Southerner, and the problem with that is that he's also not going to really be on the side of the radical Republicans in the North either. In fact, he's going to oppose a lot of the radical Republican policies. He's going to ignore some of the Southern black codes that were starting to be created that were trying to legally make African Americans less than the white populations. For example, they created laws that didn't allow African Americans to serve on juries or own land and vote. And it was all in the face of the federal government, and Andrew Johnson refused to do anything about it. And so these differences about how to go about Reconstruction between Johnson, who kind of allowed the South to keep a lot of their culture in ways, versus the radical Republicans who wanted to change things dramatically, really are going to end up being Johnson's undoing. And so in 1866, when the Republicans achieved a two-thirds majority in both houses, they essentially had the ability to override Johnson at any key moment. They could override any bill or policy that he created. And in fact, they disliked him so much that they even tried to impeach him. Now, the impeachment did get through the House, but it never made it through the Senate. So he was impeached, but he was not removed. He shares that with one other president in our nation's history. And so we talk about Johnson only to recognize that his presidency was very limited. He essentially was powerless because Congress controlled two-thirds in both houses. And so he doesn't get a lot done during his time. And in fact, he gets dismissed after he finishes out his term. And to replace him, the Republicans nominate, a familiar face here on the right-hand side, Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant was a popular figure. He actually wins re-election in 72, so he serves 8 years. But unfortunately, Grant was, I think, a lot better of a military leader than he was a presidential leader. And his campaign, or his group and party, was much more inefficient and corrupt than it probably should have been, very similar to Andrew Jackson. And so my point here being is that the Reconstruction, when we look at Reconstruction, we really look at it as a time period where these radical Republicans controlled Congress and really controlled the country. Because when they took power, and they were able to nullify the influence of President Johnson. They went out of their way to create a society that truly was dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. And so in 1866, they passed the 14th Amendment. Now, remember, the 13th Amendment was the abolishment of slavery. The 14th Amendment is then giving citizenship to former slaves. And that was meant to combat a lot of the discriminatory laws that the South had created after the war. But it was also to override that old Dred Scott decision that said people in that slaves were in fact property. And so this is trying to override that Supreme Court decision. It gives citizenship and civil rights to all persons born within the states. And if you read, it carefully, it says, no state shall enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And the key there is without due process of law. And we can talk a lot about how that kind of becomes a vague part of that institution. But it does get passed. Its intentions were good. They are going to drastically expand then the abilities of African Americans after the wars, or at least their citizenship under the law. And the Confederates are going to be required to bring in both of these amendments before they get introduced back into the Union. So before the Southern states come back, they're going to have to give citizenship, and they're going to have to get rid of slavery, and they're going to have to give citizenship. But even with all these things going on, it continued to get worse and worse in the American South. And the black codes that were created by Southern states to oppose a lot of these amendments really made radical Republicans fearful that their policies were not going to be actually enforced. So they decided to take their matters into their own hand, and they created in 1867 the Reconstruction Act. And this is where we get the term Reconstruction. And what they did was they decided that to enforce law, they were going to divide the South into 5 military districts, each that governed by 20,000 troops. So here were your 5 districts. Okay, Virginia was 1, the Carolinas were 2, and then you can kind of see on from there. And, this was an attempt to enforce law, and essentially they placed troops in between the Southern white ex-Confederates who didn't really want this to happen in the first place, and former slaves who were now trying to fight for equality. And we put, guns into a situation that already had a lot of fire and grit. And Reconstruction is going to be contentious at best. The act also temporarily disenfranchised 10,000 ex-Confederates. To disenfranchise means to take away their right to vote. And so it is really, a slap in the face. It's not that lenient plan that Lincoln envisioned for the American South or that he thought would be best. And so the radical Republicans are really, they're implementing change. They're doing good things in terms of adding rights, but it's going to come in the face of unity. It's going to cost a lot of unity in the American South, which is going to take a long time to heal and to mend. So to make sure the job was done, during Reconstruction, the radical Republicans are going to pass one final amendment, the 15th Amendment. And this is going to be an amendment to also give voting rights to African American males. Notice how I said males. We still do not have the right to vote for females all the way up until the 1900s. But it's a movement in the right way. This is going to be an amendment to give voting rights. Notice I'm just saying the right to vote. There are still going to be some laws that are going to limit that. But between the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we truly do have a country that now is working towards equality. And you see this in some of the policies the radical Republicans also made, where they actually created a Freedmen's Bureau. This was an organization that provided food and clothing, medical care, and other things for former slaves, and really gave them a jump start on life. In fact, the Freedmen's Bureau set up schools all over the American South to help them start reading and figuring out, how to bring an education in their lives, where a lot of them were illiterate before, a lot of African American children in particular. And this was very successful. In fact, these schools taught about 200,000 formerly illiterate slaves how to read. And it was a very good thing, and things were working, and things were going, at least, according to plan. But then it all came to an end, unfortunately. And in 1877, the Republicans, in an effort to stay in power, um, decided to make a decision that's really going to undercut the purpose of Reconstruction. And in 1877, the corruption of the Grant administration weakened the Republican Party. And when they nominated this guy on the left hand side, Rutherford B. Hayes, he is not going to do well against the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden. And the long story short here, because I'm running out of time, is that the Tilden gained quite a lot of votes in the American South. This was the first time that the South was allowed to re-vote in the national election. And there were a lot of disputed votes, in particular in Florida and South Carolina and in Louisiana. And there was a lot of irregularities in how the votes were counted. And essentially, if it went south, the Democrats were going to win. If it went north, the Republicans were going to win. And all of this debate eventually leads to the Republicans and the Democrats coming to a compromise. They were up in arms about it. They could not figure out how to solve the problem. And since Henry Clay wasn't around anymore, someone else has to come up with a compromise. And we call it the Compromise of 1877. And in this compromise, the Democrats agreed to accept Republican victory, but only if Reconstruction came to an end. And so both parties essentially got what they wanted. The problem with this, folks, is that when Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, it was way too soon. It was not long enough to reinvent an entire generation's mindset and reclaim their ideas and their and what they thought was best. And so, unfortunately, when we look back on Reconstruction, we recognize that it had good intentions, but it didn't last long enough. Once Reconstruction came to an end, we saw groups like the KKK reemerge and the White League organized to really oppose a lot of the amendments that had been created and oppose a lot of the things that had tried to be implemented during Reconstruction. And so in reality, instead of having a country that was truly equal in opportunity, what we found was just that Reconstruction led to extremist groups that, unified in their opposition to what Reconstruction was trying to do. And so what you're going to see after 1877 is not equality, but instead a more centralized aversion to the federal law that was meant to be created. And so instead of following the 14th and 15th Amendment, we're going to start seeing a series of laws in the South known as Jim Crow laws that are meant to oppose and really eliminate the rights that were supposed to be given to former African Americans. So I hope that helps. Hope you got a chance to fill out your notes. And we will come back and finish this when we come to next class. All of this will be on your test, so hopefully you have a chance to read over and listen to the video. So take care.